Welcome to the Oahu Railway. My name is Neil Erickson. I'm modeling the Oahu Railway and Land Company branch from Waipahu to Wahiawa. And I found it very fascinating looking into this when I started looking at railroads to model. And my interest in narrow gauge really peaked after seeing what actually happened essentially in my neighborhood. I wanted to give you an idea of what the railroad is about, a little bit about its history, and why I chose this branch to model. This image was very inspirational from next stop, Honolulu. I contacted Jim Chittock, who models the Oahu Railway as well, and asked him if I could use this image because I think it really spurs my imagination and it shows the romance of the railway running across and through the rice fields, sugarcane fields, taro fields, and up into the pineapple fields through the sugarcane into the interior of the island. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Here we go. For those who don't know, Hawaii is actually formed of 8 islands, right? The big island, Hawaii Island, down in the lower right, Maui and the surrounding islands of Lanai, Ko'olawi, Molokai, and then Honolulu or Oahu is where Honolulu is located. And far to the northwest is Kauai and Ni'ihau. The island of Oahu is where the state capital is, and it's the seat of the island. But when this railway, the Oahu Railway, was formed, the capital was on the big island of Hawaii in Hilo, near where I live now. Just as a quick aside, there was a railroad on the big island that was also built by the same people that built the Oahu Railway, the same gentleman, in fact, and it was the only standard gauge railroad in the state. But I found the allure of narrow gauge too appealing. The island of Oahu, or Oahu, um, is not large, but the railroad ran from Honolulu all the way out to the left here to the west, cut and a point, and around to the other side and ended at Kahala Mall, or excuse me, Kahala Mill. Yeah, there is a Kahala Mall, but it's not the same thing. The mill, sugar mill. So the railroad is really intended to serve the areas along the line and primarily hauled sugarcane. But it wasn't the first railway in the state. The first railroad was on Maui and then the Big Island. They were both narrow gauge, 3-foot gauge lines. But on Oahu, the first railroad was a horse-drawn carriage. These are actually mules. So I guess you could say this is 2 horsepower, very small. But I really love this picture outside the palace of the Queen. And it shows the dress of period of the day around the 1860s. You can see the unusual women's hats, but the men's pretty much wore flat tops or cowboy hats, if that was their job. Most gentlemen wore flat tops, and it was interesting that during this era, many gentlemen wore jackets and ties. Somewhere along the line, the island became really interesting to those traveling there and people traveling by merchant ships such as Benjamin Franklin Dillingham landed on Oahu on a merchant ship in 1865 and went to explore the island on horseback. The story is he fell off the horse and broke a leg and he couldn't return on the merchant ship. So he kind of fell in love with the island and began working in different places until he found a hardware store that took him on. And he stayed there for several years until he was able to buy it from the owners. So they must have been very benevolent owners because I can't imagine a merchant seaman having that much money. But he changed the name to Dillingham and Company. And then in 1896, he petitioned the government to build a railway because he saw that after the introduction of artesian wells out in the Ewa Plains, which is along the west coast of the island, very arid area. They could bring water to the surface, and with water, irrigation was possible, fields were possible. It was possible to build homes and towns out there. So the Oahu Railway and Land Company was formed, I believe, for the most part, to sell land. So the government gave him a charter to build a railroad, but essentially where he was offered to build it was where there was no land. So by using coral, he was able to build up the right of way from Honolulu Harbor all the way out past Pearl Harbor and beyond around to Kaena Point, as I said earlier. And he started by building a railway station right in Honolulu that was real typical of the time and pretty much showed a lot of his ancestry. And this is typical of a lot of the buildings along the line at that time, had a lot of European influence. So remember, this is around 1896, and he wanted to get actually, he had a bet to get the railway started before his birthday. And in order to do that, he ended up buying a plantation engine and shipping it over to get here in time. And they did run 1 mile on his birthday, so he could win the bet. Well, this photo says 1890, but I don't think it was quite that early. Um, the interesting things about this is beyond the railway shed there, or the car shed, and off to the left up in the center is that railway station that you saw in the previous picture. Um, this car shed is unique, and you'll see it in later photographs, but right in front of it you'll see that the railway switch is very different from the kind you see today, and they actually bent the rails to move from track to track. This was called a stub switch, as opposed to the kind we use today that use points. You actually bending the rails, the term came from that. On the left over here, you can see a workman's um, building, right, where they would have uh, probably workers on the railway come and they could have a place to sit and talk and manage the others. And in between the two, looks like some form of stockyard where maybe they held mules or donkeys that worked on the line. And on the far right, which is kind of hard to see, but up on a pedestal, it looks like there's an outhouse. And it wasn't uncommon simply to be right over a waterway, for better or worse. The railway, again, was built on all this coral fill, as you can see all throughout it. They had to bring all this fill material in. So you can see the large coral on the right, and then the ballast and everything else was much finer ground coral. It traveled out along the railway past, Aiea and out toward Waipahu, past Pearl City, and it again was all built on fill. And you can see on one side, the right-hand side, it looks like taro. On the left side, looks like rice fields. Not uncommon are palm trees, and you'll see them everywhere along the line. So in my mind, this is what made it really picturesque. Again, running through the countryside here, taro fields on both sides with palm trees lining the railroad, all built on this coral fill. This is the kind of image that really is evocative to me, and I'd like to recreate this in part if possible. O scale is large, but you'll see that it wasn't necessary to create a lot of it to help me get satisfied. The railroad ran, like I said, from Honolulu out around Pearl Harbor to Waipahu Junction and continued on to Kaena Point. But at Waipahu Junction, it went inland right up the center of the island to the town of Wahiawa. And it was up a gulch of about a 4.5% grade. So it was quite a trip, and it wasn't your standard railway. Very interesting. And the era that I like, actually maybe a little bit earlier than the era that had the shays, but the era that I really like was with the shay locomotives running up this branch line. Didn't last long, but That's something I found real appealing, these geared locomotives. And I'll show you some of those later. In Waipahu, right along Pearl Harbor, this is really a bad picture, but I really wanted to show the home signals there and the water tank. Waipahu became known for its many water tanks later on, but in the era that I was modeling, there was a single track running through town, had a sidings beyond, and I'll show you in a moment that it served a little freight house right next to this water tank. A map of this area, this is prior to 1921. A map of this area shows the station in the middle, right next to the stream, the Kapakahi stream, and then the junction, the Y up to Wahiawa. And you can see it says Wahiawa Branch there. And off to the right, it went to Kahuku, and off to the left, it headed back toward Honolulu. So this is the area that I found would be simple and a way to model a portion of the railroad that I could run pretty much on my own without too much help. Give me an opportunity to run some long mainline trains right through town as well. So the branch line would pick up cars left by the main line and run up to Waiwa. Although later trains directly from Honolulu came all the way up the branch on their own, and they ran double and triple headed 280s, C25s. But that's not something that I wanted to model. But if you look at the big picture, it's almost difficult to figure out where Waipahu Junction is. I circled it in a red circle down in the lower far left here. And then as it climbed up the gulches, there was a branch that ran off into the sugar fields. You can see the Y. And continued on up and out into the fields. It just ran sort of this way and that. And in this very center of the picture, and a little bit to the right on the bottom, is the town of Wahiawa. And the portion above was the airfield, Schofield. That Schofield Airfield was served by the railroad as well. All the spurs out here and little branch lines went out to serve the pineapple fields. The station in Wahiawa had sort of a family resemblance to the one in Waipahu, although it was hip roofs. But essentially the same idea, where the station agent and his family lived upstairs from the main ticketing area and baggage, and then downstairs had an open air waiting. And in this picture, it looks like a bunch of schoolgirls are headed off maybe to church or to Honolulu for a trip. Again, you can notice that men wearing shirt and ties and jackets in many cases. And the big hats that the girls are wearing places this around 1910 and 1920s. Again, flat tops, caps for the men, very, very common. Back in Honolulu, the rail yard grew and grew and grew. It became quite a going concern. The little train shed is now a big train shed, and it replaced the one from the 1890s that is still standing off to the left here. But you can see where the oil car had its ramp up where it could load and service the engines. They all ran on oil, and you can see that long ramp in the middle running up toward the engine, the roundhouse, I guess it was, in the middle there. So this is part of a large balloon loop that went into Honolulu and allowed trains to turn completely, as well as service the docks there and the Dole pineapples, many other industries. But for the most part, the passenger trains were able to circle around and then back into the station, where you can see where they are now in that train shed. The station in Honolulu grew. It was still similar to the way it was originally built. I really like this image of the 440, and again, that stub switch with its little mechanism to throw the rails or bend the rails was unique. Honolulu, I've never seen anything else like this. Very interesting. From the other side, passengers would come up on horse and carriage, and they had a beautiful entry to the station. And you can see again the very formal looking dress of everybody going on their outings. This is a pretty fabulous station. It would take an awful lot of room to model this. I think Jim's model is a much more contemporary version, but this is a beautiful station, and it begs to be modeled, despite it being rather large. As the train went down the tracks and through Aiea and near to Pearl City, there was a little quaint station there again with that same sort of European influence. I like the little round balcony up above, a little turret almost. And at the time, this little station stop was probably very, very small. I would guess this whole building is no more than 12 feet by 20 feet deep. And then it had the freight portion off to the left there and the waiting area on the right. Very cute little station. It just, again, begs to be modeled. Further down the line is Aiea. Again, you can see the family resemblance of the station. It had a second story where the family of the station agent lived, and then downstairs the open air seating, and then the baggage area and the ticketing area. On the right here, you can see, if you look carefully, it's right on the water of Pearl Harbor, and there's a dock there. And I recently went out and stood in this very location looking back, and there's a restaurant there, and you can see the Ford Island Bridge over to the Arizona Memorial. So this area is still exists, of course, but it's very open and no longer improved. And during the war years, there was a picture of it from above where nowadays you can't quite get this view because it's overgrown, but the highway is right up behind me in this picture today. But looking down, you can see Pearl Harbor and the tracks running around the edge of the harbor there. I want to say lagoon at the time. The freight house on the left, and again that family appearance of the station. And again, the station is very small. I believe it was 20 by 22 feet, and the upstairs slightly larger over the waiting area. This went around the track and came through Waipahu. And in this picture, you can see the number 64, the private car of the railroad, taking up the end of the passenger train here. And it's running through Waipahu Junction. And on the right is the freight shed. And just beyond that is the station again. And you can tell it, again, it still has that family resemblance. Across the street, on the left, is the big building, a Chinese store, and it served the area. It didn't have rail service, but I'll talk more about that in the next slide. Here's that passenger car again, now going in the opposite direction, and the station on the left here, and on the right, across from one another, is the Japanese store and the Chinese store, and one of the famous water tanks that this location was well known for. Now, I got an email from someone who said he grew up in this building on the right, and that his auntie was born and raised there and ended up marrying the man from across the street. So it wasn't uncommon for a Chinese and Japanese to be married. This little wooden bridge was replaced in around 1920s, but I thought it was terrific. So I wanted to build a model of it, and I did. And hopefully I'll have a picture of that in a moment to share with you. Here is another view of that area. This time the train is coming at us. And at this time you can see the freight house and the station beyond, but the water tank is enclosed. It's like a square water tank. And I thought that was pretty interesting, and that is very modelgenic. Again, the coral ballast and the fill material. On the left, you can see the rice fields, and the ballast and the coral fill just is all very, very white, and you can see this white fill and ballast in nearly all the photographs I found. Here is that area one more time, a little more close up, Kapakahi Stream, and the Japanese and Chinese store, and then the large store right next to the two water tanks. Again, it's indicated that the square one is next to a round one, and so the dual tanks became a real symbol of Waipahu. Again, the depot, the freight station, and later on there was a an engine house, and I see it looks like this. So here's a little later view when they built a shoe fly or a temporary track across the stream while they replaced that wooden bridge with a steel bridge. And this worked out so well, they ended up leaving that temporary bridge across Kapakahi Stream there, and it served trains that went up the branch. If you notice right in the middle, there's now an engine house right in this area and the two iconic water tanks. In this photograph, it looks as though they're both round, and in later photographs, I found they were almost all round. That square wooden one is still pretty enticing though, and it begs to be modeled. The engine house served shay locomotives or geared locomotives for only a few years because the crews didn't like them. They were too slow. They seemed to really be hard on the track. So it didn't last long, but the idea of running shays up the branch is just too appealing not to ignore. Very, very few photographs indicate what that engine house looked like. And here's one of those. You can see that the rails are no longer going into the engine house, and it runs off in a different direction there. And in this view, you can see the track that goes over the temporary bridge beyond the water tank there. So at this time, there were 3 water tanks in Waipahu, the one between the freight house and the station, and the 2 across the tracks that you can barely make out, but there's 2 water spigots up in the air there. And in this picture, you can see they're double heading the 280 locomotives. And all the locomotives, nearly all the locomotives at this time were all what we call outside frame. In other words, the wheels were concealed by the frame of the locomotives, and it allowed them to be a little bit bigger and closer to the rails. And they had a real distinctive narrow gauge look that I love. It's fantastic. And running a double-headed engine like this is very appealing. But this one coming down off the branch with pineapples, we'll see. Maybe we'll play with era, moving the era about. I did go out to this location looking for any remnants of the railway. And at this point, I don't think they called them rails to trails at the time, but there is a trail starting from this location right down by the depot, which is known as Depot Road, and it continues all the way to Honolulu. But what's there now looks nothing like a railroad unless you know what you're looking for. And you can see this steel bridge is what's remains of the steel bridge that ran across to the Y of Waipahu Junction and is now home to people living in the street, or rather on the bridge. I gave this guy my pocket full of change, so he didn't mind me taking some photographs. But if you look in the left-hand picture, the station and everything there is long gone. In fact, just to the right of this bridge is now a transfer station, in other words, a dump, and a fire station beyond. And on the left, where the station used to be, is a plumbing supply store. And everybody there was really friendly. During the war era, a lot of the railroads still ran, but they had shrouds over their headlights, and to keep it low visibility. But if you look, this is a great photograph showing the 2 water tanks, the iconic 2 water tanks in Waipahu. Again, that signal for the home road, and then that temporary set of rails that went over the bridge adjacent to the new steel bridge. So this was just about where I stood looking at the other bridge. I wish I kind of had taken a picture of it at the time, but if you notice that there was a tree growing out of it, so it was kind of hard to make out. At the heyday, there were about 44 passenger trains running a day. This is during World War II era, but a more typical schedule looks like this. And I was lucky enough to get a couple different versions of this. Oh, excuse me. Anyway, the timetable is from 1898, and I have another version from 1935. A lot changed in those eras. What you're looking at here is Depot Road that comes up adjacent to the station and heads up to Oahu Sugar. It was formed by Benjamin Franklin Dillingham and partners. And although I probably won't model much of the sugar operations, this will be a significant background scene in Waipahu. Imagine how much space this would take in any scale, so it's going to have to be foreshortened to some degree. On the lower right again are the two tracks going past the freight station, the water tank, and the station. And above is a much better picture of the Waipahu station. And I can't quite make it out, but it does look like there was the engine house beyond. I was lucky enough to meet some people that are from Waipahu, and they introduced me to aunties who grew up in the area and working in the sugar mill. And they gave me a bunch of magazines that were published by the sugar mill that showed fantastic photographs, including the previous ones of Depot Road, and pictures of the sugar mill. And it's just fascinating how the culture, the Japanese culture, influenced so much of the design of the homes and temples there. What I also found really fantastic in this photo that's difficult to see is on a trestle right through the middle here is looks like a narrow gauge railway, probably sugarcane cars going into where this building is that would unload the sugarcane and pull it into another area for them to be crushed. So again, this is huge. But if you look beyond, the hills are pretty much alive with sugarcane. Um, Not many trees. Fascinating how such a huge area can be cultivated entirely by hand. So it required lots and lots of workers. So how did I model this? Well, I don't have a large area. In fact, this is a former drafting studio that was above some horse stables that we had years ago, and I used it for storage and then eventually closed it in. And you can see that the edges of the room are only 4 feet high. Even though it seems like it's 24 feet wide, the real useful space is about 15 to 16 foot square. Because you have to stand about 6 feet away from that outside wall in order to be able to stand up at all. But I thought it would be really interesting to take advantage of that space. So my first inclination is to fit as much track as possible in there. And, it's just be going around the walls a few times and just watch the train run and have places to go. It'd be pretty amazing. And in HO scale, I could do something with lots of track. And this is a very famous railroad, and I'm sure those who know it will recognize the Gory and Defeated Railroad. And as much as I love this railroad, it would just be more than a lifetime project. This is a very famous railroad for lots of reasons, but the amount of track in there, the amount of effort to build this railroad was huge. I started looking at ON30 because narrow gauge railway in O scale using HO gauge track or HO gauge is super, super appealing to me. And I love those narrow gauge locomotives of the Oahu Railway. So I started looking at published plans and found this one, Red Mountain Railway, which is sort of a nod in my mind to the red dirt that we have here in Hawaii. Um, but it didn't really fit what I wanted to do, so I ended up modifying this so it would have a return loop and go down and come back through the main town here, then go out into the sugar fields up to the plantation area, the pineapples in the Y. And this railroad came along quite a ways, and I began, running trains and having a lot of fun with it, mocking up buildings and experimenting with scenery, doing a little backdrop painting. And, in retrospect, it was a great experience, but ultimately it met the chainsaw and didn't last very long. At the time, I didn't have any idea where to get coral for my ballast along the railroad or the right of way. But I've since figured out that coral sand is manufactured right here in Hawaii, and you can buy it by the 50-pound bag. Anyway, again, the trestle, everything here you see was built by hand. The railway went up to the pineapple fields, and they had a loading area. And on the right, a sugar company was mocked up. And honestly, this was a lot of fun. However, in O scale, I realize all this stuff takes a lot of space. And my aisles, designed like John Armstrong recommended, with 20-inch pinch points, really made it uncomfortable to have more than one person in there. In fact, it was very uncomfortable for me to be in there, one working on the railroad or hauling materials around. And this was a good try. My track lane skills got a lot better doing this, but the railroad didn't run very well. And since then, I've learned a lot about electronics and making trains and locomotives run well. So I went back to the drawing board. So what if, I thought, what if the railroad was built on a couple of shelves, like a 2-level railroad, away from that 4-foot sidewall, and incorporating the slope of the ceiling into a backdrop, similar to what I did before, but making it a little more compact, more like a shelf railroad. And so there's a lot of publications out there, but my interest again was railroads in Hawaii. So I started gathering up a lot of materials. This started by my wife's employer gave me a couple of very classic books, and I was able to find more and more and more. And it's become a passion just to collect everything that's been published about the Oahu Railway. In fact, for all the railroads of Hawaii. So the question was, how far am I going to take this, right? Am I going to take the railway from Honolulu all the way out to the mills along the coast? The scenery was magnificent, of course. Ran along the edge of the I'm drawing a blank on the name of the mountains there, but all along the coast. And again, you can see it's all built up on fill. Another famous photograph coming back from Ka'ena, in other words, that real picturesque area out and beyond. And right about this location is where the existing Hawaiian Historical Railway stops. And this is a little bit beyond, but it's a really neat area. And again, it's very appealing, but takes a lot of space. What era? The most photographed era is during World War II. And I got a lot of really good pictures of the locomotives that ran pretty much throughout the railroad's history from these photographs, because even though I want to run the Shea locomotives from 1920, the locomotives here were pretty much the same, maybe in a little bit better condition. If you went out around the coast to the other side, the railroad built a hotel to encourage people to come visit. And it did. It brought presidents and kings and queens and royalty from all over the world. And it had a really beautiful lagoon, little boats that people could ride in. And the railroad stopped right there, and you get out and walk across a bridge to the hotel. It must have been a very elegant experience. And you can see from these photographs that the hotel was top notch. It was beautiful. And I don't remember how many rooms it had, but it was probably built in black and white. Nah, not really. On the lower right, you can see a colorized version. But remember, this is from the 1890s. And at the time, it was probably a most beautiful hotel on the island. This rendering again, I love this because it shows all the men and women sitting around, and they're all dressed for boating essentially. Those flat caps are known as boat caps as well. So again, you can see that the hotels might have been yellow and white with red roofs, but it's hard to tell. So many were in black and white. Um, as an architect, I found a lot of the details in this super appealing, and I've tried to incorporate some of these in my own projects. If you look beyond there, you can see the locomotive and the passenger cars with a covered um, station per se, and just an unloading area, loading area that you walk across the bridge here on the lower right, and you can see this little beautiful pergola that frames the entry to the bridges. So what was I going to model and how could I do this? Again, I was drawn back to Waipahu and that branch line up to Wahiawa. And so started sketching, and you can't do very much in O scale, at least not faithfully or crowding a lot of tracks. So I started fooling around with sketches, and on the left, Waipahu Junction, Waipahu, you can see my engine house, the station, the freight house. And although he didn't ever have a spiral or a secondary track running through town, I found that if I could run the railroad up along the outside of the walls, I could climb and get up to a second deck without having to do a helix, or a bunch of spirals. Underneath that round spiral, I would include some staging loop and staging tracks so that I could bring cars out from um, Kahuku and bring it around through the railroad, and then it would go back into that same area as Honolulu and vice versa. As the railroad progressed around the edges of the room, it would climb up and cross in front of the door, unfortunately, a couple of times, until it gets to Dole Siding. And this is an area that would branch off and go to Schofield. I haven't modeled that yet, but this was an area where the pineapples would be loaded into cars, and they would be all staged along here for pickup and delivery by the local. And there were a lot of industries in town. Well, compared to Waipahu, there's a bunch of spots where cars could be left, right? So a little cattle yard, freight house, the cannery, storage office, and team track. So not a lot, but enough to keep you busy. And then the railroad went off into the fields again for more pineapple loading. So you could run out and pick up a loaded train of pineapples and then leave some empties. So I started building the railroad um, using conventional sort of box frames and shelf layout design. And I wanted to experiment with spline roadbed and making my own homosote base, the subroad bed. So I would cut a bunch of this into strips, ran it through my, I want to say jigsaw, but it's somebody name it for me. Anyway, cut all these at an angle so they had a slope to the ballast, and kerf them so that you could bend it easily around corners. Does take time? Not as much time as I thought, and I enjoy this journey. It's building the railroad to me is my hobby. Getting it done someday. We'll see how that goes. I started thinking about how I was going to lay out that staging area, so I was able to get 4 tracks into the return loop because it needs to represent Kahuku and Honolulu. So having 2 trains in each direction would be entirely possible. In fact, the tracks in this loop are very long. I could probably accommodate even 2 trains because even though the railroad ran trains up to 44 cars long, it's not likely I'll do that, but it is possible. I like to hand lay my own switches, so I did a little photograph of here of how I lay down my ties. You gauge the track and build your own frogs. And you can see I do use some circuit board ties we call PC ties. And on the right, you can see the yard throat that goes around the support for my pole barn, which no longer is a barn, but It's the upstairs of an old pole barn. There's not much room in this area, so I have to sit down to work on there, and I have a little stool and a drop leaf that brings you in and around the tracks. So I could sit there if I wanted and set up trains and remove cars, just to give a little variety. This is sometimes known as a mole hole. So my mole hole on the right here, and my yard throat on the left. Again, there's that support for the old barn. So there's not much light in there. I've used a bunch of these type of swing arm lights, but someday I'll get something more permanent in there. As the railroad circled through the visible part um, in the room, I mock up the station and laid some of this Pico flex track just to help speed things up. On the lower middle, you can see there's that image of Depot Road up past the station and the Oahu Sugar Company beyond. And I think this is going to be really effective and a lot of fun to give a little bit of forced perspective there. On the lower right, I built a little wooden bridge going into Waipahu from Kahuku direction. And it doesn't show up on the upper right photograph, but a lot of these are taken over time. Again, laying down my Homosote roadbed and laying down these tracks and building switches. Um, to me, this is enjoyable. This is a good part of the hobby, and I like that. You can see over on the left the 4 tracks of the staging area. So this is a good overview. And in the right, as I work my way around with a spline road bed, you can see a little bit of the visible part of the railroad coming across the rice fields down on the bottom left there. Seems to be something missing here, but anyway. Um, well, that's a swing gate, and there's a door there somewhere. Anyway, it's hard to picture, but at any rate, moving along, building the upper deck, the town of Wahiawa has the passing track and the spur off to the um, cattle, you know, where the loading and unloading would be, and on the right would be the station, and it goes off to the cannery beyond. My spline roadbed is built up of layers of homosote and masonite. I found this works really well, gives it a lot of strength and a lot of flexibility. So I could go quite far without it distorting too much. And in the middle is where the line runs up the outside wall to the upper deck. And it was built as hidden trackage, but I imagine someday having um, cameras in my engine so I can enjoy the view in the hidden area as well. This is not something to recommend. It's very tedious to do after the fact. I use a program called SketchUp. This is called Photo Match within SketchUp, and you can, trace over the buildings so that you can draw them and get a footprint of them and an exterior elevations like this, and that would give you an idea of how big it was and how it might be built as a model. But of course, as soon as I did that, I found a published plan that was more accurate, I'm afraid. Well, it's good. It was a good exercise. Um, the town of Eva had a real simple station, and I enjoyed finding this from the 1890s. And this is the location of the Hawaii Railway Historical Society now. This station is no longer there, but they have plans and money to build a new station. I sort of did my own abbreviated version using the kit, and it doesn't look a lot like it, but it was fun to do. Next up will be the town of Wahiawa and build another station. Hopefully it'll look sort of like this, but this is probably in the 1950s near abandonment and doesn't look so great. Again, Wahiawa and the pineapple spur, where the loading and unloading of pineapples would occur. And I found a map of Wahiawa and then the cannery and a bunch of industries and other businesses along here. I think the cannery must have been a big deal if it had 2 or 3 tracks that could be loaded from the platform. They must have had different um, needs. The warehouse probably received cans, and then the platform might have received pineapples. I'm not sure, but this shows proposed switch and siding, right? So I think it leaves a little bit to my discretion of how I'm going to model this. Very few photographs exist of the cannery, but you can see the smokestacks above from the boilers, and then the warehouse in front here for the railroad, I believe, or for the cannery. Here's looking from another point of view, that warehouse for that storage spur. And I believe this is another picture of that warehouse, and you can see the loading dock in the front and then the warehouse on the right. An aerial was taken at some point that showed the railroad running through the town of Wahiawa and the spur that went off to Schofield Barracks. So if you notice over on the right, the main line runs right down through there, and you can see the pineapple spurs and storage tracks. This was one of three Shay locomotives used on the line. This was used for building the line that was originally called tunnel because it was built to, build the tunnel. The one that was used on the branch was one of two sisters, number 44 and 43, and they were big, big steam locomotives. And they, hopefully, I can model some of these. I've got some parts from Shapeways that will fit on another locomotive. Here's what one looks like right before it was scrapped, which is a shame. And I did mention that up the branch they ran double-headed locomotives, and in this case they're bringing either ballast or lime back down the branch because there was a mine up in the branch line. So it was entirely possible that the double-headed locomotives just went up to service the mine, or probably a lot more. At this point, there were a lot of trees, so this is probably a little bit later in the railroad's life. But running these double-headed locomotives has a lot of appeal, and I love the look of them. And you can see the guys standing on there. It's a lot of fun. And in this picture, they actually had three locomotives, triple-headed they call it. And you can see the boxcars beyond. A lot of boxcars at this era were outside framed and were brought in from other railroads. Today, a lot of the railroad and locomotives don't look so good. This is the former. I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank on the number, but you can see it's seen better days. The Hawaii Railway Society has a couple of diesel locomotives that were used down on the piers and down in Dole Cannery, and these pull the passenger trains for tourists. And I got to ride on the President's car, or number 64. You can lease this whole car for yourself, and a bunch of guys went with me, and we made an outing for my birthday. It's been right before COVID, so about 2019. So not many pictures exist of the cabooses, but this is one. But I'm running out of time, and I wanted to share as much as I could with a little history of the railroad and how and why I'm building what I am. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to get in touch with me, my email is listed there, erickson.nielc@gmail, or you can see me on the Model Railroad Hobbyist Forum, the Pine Spur Chronicles. Thank you for listening.